counter negativity bias. Live your life as if it's rigged in your favor. I think when you do that, you just behave differently compared to when you let and allow the little voice inside your head to take over.
Hi there, I'm Bex Craig, and you're listening to the Not Just Anything podcast for women who want it whole. I hope you'll join me each week as we hear extraordinary stories from women around the world about how they have curated a whole life by design rather than by default. This week, I'm speaking to Sue Stevens, who leads Facebook's growth business in Malaysia. With extensive experience across the technology industry, Sue is known as an incredibly inspiring leader and change advocate who's passionate about people and belonging. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed our conversation, as Sue is just one of those people who draws you into her story and her passion. We explore everything from her own career and life experiences to how she intentionally co-designs her life with her husband, to what it would mean if we could all show up fully as ourselves at work. It's an alive conversation with plenty of fantastic takeaways. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. A really big warm welcome to Sue Stevens, who's joining me here today in Singapore. Welcome to the podcast, Sue.
Thank you, Bex. I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. So for full context, Sue and I have known each other for a number of years, but recently reconnected, knowing that you're now based in Singapore, having previously, in my knowledge of you, been in Europe. So been looking forward to hearing about your journey and about your story. And I know that you've got a story to share, as many people do. So maybe we can get started with hearing a bit about that, a bit about you and a bit about the journey that has brought you to where you are today.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just so excited to be here and also for our paths to come together again. So originally I was born on the island of Curacao in the Caribbean, which is a Dutch colony. And at age 7, I moved to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam specifically. So I identify with being Dutch. I identify with being from Amsterdam specifically. And I think this transition is probably one of the first things in my journey that shapes me to be who I am today. Because for lack of a better analogy, I went from mostly raisins to becoming raisin in porridge, moving to the Netherlands and becoming, I guess, very much aware of my intersectionality. Now, not at the age of 7, but much later. So I think that's the very first thing that I would say. I spent a number of years in HR, which is where I started my career as an HR business partner, as a recruiter, head of talent acquisition and employer branding. I have been afforded many opportunities in the tech sphere, working for great companies such as Nokia, Canon, Hewlett-Packard. And it's actually Canon that took me on a journey from Amsterdam to London, which was my first international stint. But after a while in HR, I figured that I really wanted to get some commercial exposure and experience, which is when I moved across to customer success in LinkedIn in London, which is where you and I would have crossed paths. And loved that experience of being more client facing, more commercial, intertwined in the business, that I decided, why not go even a step further and jump on the other side, which is sales leadership. So that's where I'm at today. I'm at Facebook here in Singapore, and I lead what's called our growth businesses for Malaysia specifically. And what that means is that my team and I work with small businesses and we help them grow through Facebook's advertising solutions.
Amazing. And thank you for painting that picture for us. And what I love that you're talking about, even from the first sort of introduction to yourself that you gave, is all of these different moments and pieces of your journey in time that really there's like a current of change and exploring new lands and exploring new versions also of yourself. So what has that journey, I guess, been like? Obviously, there's been a lot in that you just described.
So it's interesting when I look back on the journey, like now it's very obvious. It's a portfolio career, rather eclectic, from HR into sales leadership and what have you. But quite frankly, I always thought I was going to become a dancer and tour with the likes of Michael Jackson and Justin Timberlake and what have you. Sadly, I got injured, and because of that, I couldn't pursue a career in dance. And life happens when you're busy making other plans. And I guess thankfully so, because now I met my husband. So I pivoted, and it wasn't necessarily a very conscious decision. The thing I will say that these moves and changes have in common is that I love new projects, building, starting things from scratch, or perhaps crisis management, perhaps a team that needs turning around. So every single opportunity that came along the way, there was either something new that hadn't been done before that really required someone to come in and figure out how to do that. Or it was, hey, we're grappling with a meaty problem. Will you come on board to figure out like how can we turn things around and do things next? But what I learned in this journey, there was a very pivotal moment in that. When I was in HR at some point and I was on the assignment in London, my vision of career was very much I'm going to be an HR director within 5 years and I'll be the youngest in the company to do that. So my view of career was very linear and it was upwards and not so much the jungle gym, which Sheryl Sandberg refers to. And it obviously didn't work out that way. And what I learned from that is that every time I took on something new, and if we use that analogy of a ladder, and I climbed a little bit, maybe sideways, I was able to see something which before I couldn't see from the previous position where I was standing. And with that new gained perspective, I kind of shifted my perspective of, right, what do I do next? So if there's one thing I learned in all of those moves and steps, which is take it one step at a time. It does make sense, maybe not in a moment, but when you look backwards and focus on your strengths and really, really invest in relationships, because that's, as you will know from LinkedIn, relationships really matter. And I think a lot of these moves have that in common as well, where perhaps I joined the previous boss, a colleague, but a builder by nature, adventurous, and just love to take on a new challenge.
Yeah, you can actually feel that as you're sort of buzzing as you're talking about like, oh, there was this challenge and that was going on. And so what is it that lights you up so much about that kind of building, that getting stuck in there of something that's really new and needs somebody to come in and roll their sleeves up?
That's a really good question. So I'm currently enrolled in a degree in organizational behavior at INSEAD. And a lot of the things that I'm doing is actually going back to my childhood and figuring out like, why am I the way I am? Ultimately, with a view of understanding team dynamics and how and why do people behave the way they do. And I think part of the reason is classic, typical middle child syndrome. So I'm one of three. I have two siblings. My sister's 5 years older. My brother's 2 years younger. And they're both still in the Netherlands. And I think growing up, I didn't feel as seen. And bless my mom, she's fantastic and definitely one of my heroes. But I think as that middle child, I felt that I was hidden perhaps between the firstborn and the only boy, that I wanted to figure out a way to do things different to make me stand out. Now, I don't know that that was necessary because I think moms always love their children wherever they are in the pack. But looking at my place in the family and the trend that it has had in my career with all of these different roles and what have you, I'd like to think that perhaps I'm a bit of a rebel and trying to explore pushing boundaries and seeing how can I do things differently and how do I shape things differently. So I think it's largely influenced by the fact that I'm a middle child and that I've wanted to find opportunities and ways to stand out and do things differently in comparison to my siblings, if I'm really honest, Bex.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that lots of second-born children are listening and probably feeling the same way. I'm a firstborn, so I don't have that necessarily in common. But I am thinking about my second boy, and he is wanting to stand out and to shine and to find ways that even as a baby he'd smile much more than my eldest did, and I thought that was kind of a way of drawing people to him. So it's interesting that you kind of cite that, and what one of the phrases that you use that I found to be quite moving for me, as you said, it was about being seen. So what is it about being seen for you that is important?
Yeah, I'm really passionate about that. So being seen, so if I take it a step back, it's all about belonging. Human beings are wired for connection and to do so, to belong as part of a community, a society, and a family. So for me and for many, I think just people in general, it's really to know that you are being noticed for who you are, not necessarily your mask, and the value that you bring to the table within an organization. And that is that you can be authentic and bring your quirky side or whatever it is for you. So for me, being seen, and I relate that back to a story, which was the transition that I made from Canon to LinkedIn. What I realized in that time is I worked in a relatively traditional environment, traditional Japanese organization. And I then made the transition over to LinkedIn. And I hadn't necessarily realized in my time at Canon that I had started covering much more, really to fit in. And if we unpack covering, it's really around starting to dress more like the majority, using the vocabulary, perhaps lowering my voice because I don't know if you remember, but I'm loud by nature and bubbly and I smile and I laugh a lot. And I just noticed how I started like taking that a notch down and more and more and more. And so much so that I actually didn't feel like I was bringing myself, my authentic, true self to work. And when I moved across to LinkedIn in the first couple of months, I remember that I couldn't believe it. People were coming to work in jeans. They were saying what they like, it seemed fully what they had on their minds in meetings. And I just didn't know how to. I lost touch with that because of my prior experience. But in that move from Canon to LinkedIn, that is the most pivotal moment that I recall in terms of being seen and the culture around belonging and me being able to show up as a Black woman to say, I'm now going to wear my hair natural, which is what you're seeing here, meaning the way it grows and not experiment with toxic products because I wanted to show and look like sleek and long because that's not what it's naturally like. So being seen for me, it is part of belonging. However, it's in such way that it's true to who you are. And it's not that you're trying to fit in because the majority is a certain way.
Yeah, it's so powerful, and as you're talking about it, it's moving to hear you describe it in those terms as well. And you've kind of explained that from the point of view of situational and environmental, one place to the next, of you noticing that you had sort of started to quieten and to armor up, mask up a little bit, and what it was like to then sort of be back to yourself. But what was that process like, and what was the experience of realizing I haven't been fully able to be myself until now?
The most fascinating part is that I didn't realize it when I was covering. I only realized it when I was in an environment where I felt like, wow, everyone's so different. They're really themselves and they're not trying to be one certain way. And I remember this moment vividly, the day that I remembered, like, oh, wow, like I could just be who I am. The moment was being nominated for what's called the top 30 ethnic minority role models for the Financial Times, which is something that is ran for a couple of years now, and really with a view of showcasing different role models that are doing a lot in terms of the work with pushing the agenda to help ethnic minorities really progress in their careers. And at the time, the EMEA director at LinkedIn asked if I would want to be nominated for this. And I was like, wow, like, oh my God, she thinks I can be nominated for this. And mind you, at this point, there's no guarantee you even make this list. But simply the fact that someone had seen me and recognized the value that I brought to the organization by showing up the way that I did and said, hey, I think it would be great for us to just really expose you that way. And I went on to be nominated, making the list, and the response that I got, the number of people that wrote to me to say that, wow, the fact that you talk about coming from a very humble background, a single parent family, English is not your first language, having moved to all these countries is incredibly inspiring. And for me, up until that point, I'm like, I'm just Sue Stevens. I'm very normal. I still think that is the case, absolutely. But in that moment, when I recognized and realized the power of being seen and the impact of being a role model, I was like, wow. And then it was actually in that moment that I transitioned and started to speak up more. It helped me find my voice and to actually get in tune with the fact that, yes, I am a Black woman in a position, in a leadership position. Before, I didn't really talk about that and acknowledge the fact that I look the way that I do. I just wanted to be like the same as everyone, even though I talked about that authenticity piece and I'm bubbly and what have you. I didn't factor in something which is hugely important, which is my race and gender. So that would be the pivotal moment that I would describe where, in fact, it wasn't perhaps myself, but more so someone else who was like, hey, I see a real opportunity here for you to showcase to the world like your story. And I will say to this day, I do use a lot of stories because I think your story is one of the most impactful things that you can own and share with others. And your story is yours to own. Nobody else has that story.
I could not agree more. There is so much power and strength in owning your story, as you've just said, and telling it, and for others to feel inspired. And I see you doing that. That's part of the reason why I really wanted to kind of have this conversation with you today. And so I'm curious, you've had this moment where you've recognized this and where you've stepped fully into who you are. How does that inform you as a leader now? Something I know that you're passionate about belonging. I know that authenticity matters to you, and that having yourself show up as who you are and others around you is meaningful. What does that mean in terms of the way that you then lead, in terms of the way that you then build teams and encourage others around you to show up?
So I think that by virtue of my intersectionality, I think my antenna is just much more out there in terms of figuring out, like coming to Asia, for example, working out silence. And what does that mean? Silence doesn't necessarily mean I agree with what you've just said. So I think what it means in terms of me as a leader is that I can really connect and resonate with what it perhaps might mean that someone feels they need to be a certain way in order to fit in. And that on the flip side, that I'm much more aware of that. And as such, like diversity and inclusion isn't like a once a year thing. It's a much more every week kind of little moments of, hey, I noticed in that meeting with that particular like senior individual that potentially you may have showed up a different way in comparison to when we weren't speaking to someone as senior. Is that observation correct? So I think what it means is that I have these attendees that are out there, and I'm comfortable with asking regarding observations and having those conversations that perhaps we need to have much more of in the workplace. And it also means that I think from a very vulnerable position that, especially in my time here now in Asia, there's so much that I don't know and that I'm still learning about working in this part of the world and what the different cultures in Asia mean, that I'm comfortable being uncomfortable in asking and leading with that vulnerability and hopefully showcasing to my team that it's okay not to know and kind of ask always in a respectful manner. So I think that's how it shapes and influences my worldview in general and my leadership as such as well.
It's what I love about what you've just framed there is that it's leading with that question. It's leading with asking and getting curious, as opposed to coming into anything with an assumption, with an expectation of what somebody else might be feeling. So, and I love that idea of kind of tapping into that curiosity. And yeah, there might be information that I don't know, but what actually happened in that scenario for you, so and so, and what was going on, and just giving people the space to actually explore that and recognize that for themselves. Super, super powerful. And so obviously you've lived and worked now in so many different parts of the world. And if you think about that, and then also what you've been talking about, if I were to then ask you, who exactly are you? How would you describe your authentic self?
Wow, that is such a good question. I think it's ever evolving. The way that I think about this question now more than before is how Michelle Obama talks about it. Michelle Obama talks about becoming and the fact that you're not just one thing and it's not static. So the Bex that you are today is not the Bex that you're going to be a year from now. So if I talk about and I think about who am I in the world, then there's key values, core values that I think about in terms of how I lead. If I think about in general my purpose, I think about like at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, I want the people that I love to love me back. And that's not to say that I'm not worthy of that love. It's to say that I want to ensure that how I show up in the world is always consistent with ensuring that. So if there's that important thing, like what have I prioritized? Was it that work project, that late night meeting, or was it that thing that really, really matters to me? So I think about me in the world as someone who is, like the intersectionality is there. I'm not just one thing. I think about someone who is ever evolving. And I know that like the more I know, the more I realize there's so much I don't know. And that's actually super exciting to like, come to this side of the world, be in Southeast Asia where there's so much happening in terms of growth and opportunity and potential. I think about my purpose, which is really largely around to help people from underserved communities and help them through mentoring, through some of the work that I'm doing with charities here in Singapore, with the poorer communities, because I am absolutely convinced that whilst talent may be distributed equally, opportunity is not. And to be able to provide access to opportunity by opening my network to others, I know that's something that's hugely important. And it's something that I personally benefited from, that someone did for me once. So intersectional, not just one thing, ever evolving, really the becoming notion, and the piece around serving, giving back, and just knowing that when it's all said and done, there's something far bigger at play than perhaps just the professional angle. So a holistic life and well-being.
Oh, goodness me. I mean, that is just a beautiful way of putting it. And I think so perfect for the context of this show, which is exactly that. We are not just anything. We are not just one part of who we are. And in particular, our professional identity is but a part of what makes us who we are. And so what does this, you've given us a great kind of insight into your values and also into your purpose, but what would living this holistic life that you describe, a fulfilled life, mean to you?
Yeah, I reflected on this question, and I think at different times in my life, it means different things. So obviously it sounds lovely, this massive vision and purpose and what have you. But let's face it, life is not easy. Like the pandemic happened, we were all at some point boxed up at home. And in those moments, it's not like I'm thinking about a grandiose vision. I'm just thinking like, I'm fed up. I want this to be done and over with now because I would love to travel and see my family. But taking a step back and keeping perspective, meaning of living a fulfilled life, the way I think about it personally is how I manage my energy. So I love productivity hacks, but there's nothing you can do to get more time. There's only things you can do to get more energy. So how I think about it is really the four energy quadrants. So this is physical, it's emotional, it's mental, and it's spiritual. So every year I write my vision for the year. My husband and I do that together. Believe it or not, we have our family OKRs
Love that.
that are really around like
We
us.
have that too, and I love it. So I'm like geeking out right now.
So we've got like the health thing in there, our date nights, financial, family,
Love
what
it.
have you. But I think it starts with knowing what is the definition of a life well lived for me, for us. And having that not in my head, but documented through a vision, which I've written, or a vision board, which is much more visual. I'm very visual. Then it means that I can be really honest with myself. I could say, oh, I really care about community and I want to do all this stuff. But if I look at my calendar, where are these actions and where is that time represented? Or if I'm taking on too much and I go back to physical energy, am I draining myself in such way that at the end of the day, it's actually not going to be good for anyone because you can't pour from an empty cup. So I think about it from the four energy quadrants, And I think about it about being very intentional and making sure that you're writing it down, contracting with others, getting other people involved in what is it that you have set out for life. And that also means that sometimes I need to walk away from things, because it's not because I set out to have this grandiose vision that aligns with everyone or everything. And that's okay, because that's part of the journey. But I think if you're intentional and you write it down, that for me is the greatest shot that you can have at living a meaningful life. And so far, I've been doing the vision writing now for about 6 years. And I can say that between 80 and 90% of what I set out that to say that I want that year to represent ends up happening. And it's not about getting that 100%. It's just about being intentional, saying what you would like to happen, to then go and figure out a way of how it can happen, and then look back to see like, hey, what did I actually do to progress in that area of my life?
Yeah, I want to like highlight this, underline this, jump up and down and scream so that that listeners sort of take this in, because for me, everything that you've just described there is exactly what is the shift from living by default to living by design. It's about saying like, I have a role in the choices that I'm making about my energy, about my time, about my effort as I manifest and walk towards the vision that I want for myself, as opposed to feeling like life is happening to me, which many of us do. So it sounds like you are super intentional about making sure that the parts of your life come together in such a way that create that sense of meaning, create that sense of fulfillment. Is that something? So you've been doing this for 6 years now. Sounds like progress has been made. How do you bring that intentionality outside of a macro plan into the everyday, into the here and now?
Well, I'll start by countering it and saying that there's moments that I fall off the boat. So, for example, in my vision this year, I've written about I want to get at least an average of 7 hours of sleep. I want to ensure that I'm writing in my gratitude journal and that I'm meditating on a regular basis. But if I look at these three things specifically that I just call out and I do like a Q1 look back of Sue Stevens, I don't think I'm on track at present. So, and I just want to say this for context, because living life intentionally and documenting it doesn't mean that you're not going to fall off the bandwagon. I
Yeah.
think it just means that I have this heightened awareness, like, okay, where am I at, and what's playing in my life right now that has caused me to be where I am, and how do I go back to that place that I know feels right for me. And the reason these things are important to me is because I know then I show up way better the next day and the day after when I have these things. So for me, I'm a firm believer of if it's not in your calendar, it is not important and it's never happening. So people who say, oh, let's meet up soon. Soon is not a date in my calendar. We need to have a proposal and lock it. And this is where I guess the Dutch directness is coming out there. So I'm very intentional about my calendar. I have my vision reviews scheduled in there. My husband and I have our financial reviews in there. Date night is in there. Our catch up with family time is in there. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't shift, because let's face it, life happens. But if it's not in there to begin with, there isn't anything to shift. So
Totally.
I just try and like have it captured in my calendar. My husband and I, we send each other calendar invites and what have you. And then from there, we can start to shift and play things around as life happens. Because that Sunday afternoon call with family might not happen every Sunday, and that's okay. But I think the accountability piece with myself, but also making sure that I'm talking to others, those that are important around me in work, outside of work, know what it is that I'm up to in life and therefore can help me. So I'll give you an example, something that I feel very vulnerable sharing, but I'm going to share anyway. So I'm enrolled in this organizational behavior degree at INSEAD. It took me about 7 years to get the courage to actually sign up to do this. And I just kept downloading the brochure, writing it in my vision every year, and just look, every year the fee would go up. And then one day my husband said to me, like, look, deal. You're either going to sign up and do this thing and do some research and figure out is it for you or not, or you might just want to give up on this, I'm going to do it, and not actually take any steps and actions to progress towards getting that accomplished. And I thought, and he is my number one fan and supporter. So this was a bit of tough love, which I needed. But the real reason why I wasn't putting myself forward is because I feared the rejection. INSEAD is such a great institute, and you don't just get in there. So this procrastinating behavior, even though I had written it in my vision, had all to do with my insecurity around like, oh, I don't know if I'm actually good enough to get into INSEAD. So in the end, I was like, okay, let's go back to life well lived. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to fill out the damn application form and spend as much time as I can to really do it in such way that is satisfactory to me. If I don't get in, which is out of my control, so be it. I gave it my best shot. And I spent about 4 months, and I wrote all that was necessary for this application. I submitted it and I got in. But yeah, for many years, I just moved it across from my vision to the next year. So that accountability piece was so true in my husband saying, like, hang on a minute, you keep moving it. Like, what's happening with this? And now I think, man, if I had done it like 7 years ago, the fees would have been less.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, but I'm so appreciating how open you've been. Thank you for being vulnerable. You said it feels vulnerable to share that, because I think, actually, I always feel like this with people that come onto the podcast, extraordinary people, and you are really an extraordinary woman and leader, and so it might surprise people to hear that you have that moment of, am I good enough to get in? I'm like, of course you'd be, of course you get into INSEAD, and what else was it that strengthened some muscle for yourself to go from the self-doubt, self-talk, am I good enough, to, well, I'm just gonna go for it, as you said, and some things are out of my control. How have you, over the 7 years that's taken to get to this point, also strengthened that own muscle internally?
I think of something my husband said, and he comes back in this. So really the support from those around you, because I don't think you can ever do life alone. It was when I was going for my driving license many, many years ago now, and I worried about not passing in one go. And my husband's a data scientist, so very rational and perhaps the opposite of me. And he said to me, I don't get it. You don't have a license now. If you go up for the exam and you fail, you still don't have a license. So net, the same. And I remember that, and then apply that together with the power of the pack of those people around me who supported me to say, like, okay, let's spark up a bit of courage and just get it done. And I do believe in the power of journaling. I journal a lot. Well, I just told you I fell off the bandwagon, which is absolutely true. But for most parts, if we look at it on an average in a whole year, then I do like to spend a lot of time journaling. And I think those moments where I journal consistently, I know that my self-talk has the power to shift. So in the time that I was going through that process to really decide, like, how are we going to afford it? And do I put myself forward? And what about the time commitment and work and what have you? I journaled consistently. And in there, there's always a section in the journal that I use, which is either a best self or 5-minute journal, which is a positive affirmation. And the one that I would write is to do with, I have been successful in my application at INSEAD, and I feel very proud about that. So I think in that there were just two parts, which was getting the application done, and I've been successful. The first part I totally owned and controlled. The second part I didn't. But at that point, it didn't matter anymore. I was so damn proud when I just hit submit.
Yeah, as you should be, and it's so refreshing also to hear celebrating that, taking time to stop and say, actually, what am I proud of? What do I just want to recognize? Everything's not perfect. Things might, not everything that I might have wanted for myself has maybe come true. And yet there's still things that I want to recognize about what I've done and what I've achieved and who I am and who I'm being, or whatever it might be. So I love that idea of just taking a moment, taking a beat to just smell the roses, basically.
And we don't do it often enough, if I'm honest, as human beings, but potentially as women.
Yeah, I do think that. I do think that is true. And I also wonder if it is also part of kind of the culture, the conditioning within the culture that we have at the moment, which is very future focused, which is very, Eckhart Tolle always talks about the power of now, the power of just stopping and saying like, well, where are we now? And what are we in this moment, which is really what he describes as all we have. But we are all very in the future and all very, very vision. And something else that you said that I kind of just want to riff with you a little bit on, given your intellect, which is you talked about this idea that the power of the pact, which I completely subscribe to myself. I feel like this is I was sitting there, I was like, oh yeah, I so resonate with that. And I know with all the work that I do with women and with, that this is probably true for a lot of people, that there's fear. And, that fear isn't a real thing, right? Danger is real. Fear is not a real thing. And yet it has power to take hold. And so I'm just kind of wondering, where does this come from?
I think so. If we go back, and this is kind of evolutionary, if we go back in time, and we've evolved immensely as humans, but actually not that much. Because if you think about it, what this really comes down to is negativity bias, which at some point in time was really useful, because if the lion is coming, you better get the hell out of there, because the lion's going to eat you, right? So you just, I think, much more prone in that sort of time for what could go wrong. Now, nowadays, there's no lions chasing us per se, but there is the fear of failure. What does that mean to your persona? What does that mean? How does it come across? What do other things? So I think there's just a translation of what humans are like 100% wired to think of what could go wrong over what could go right. And it's with when you receive feedback and someone's giving you praise and you think to yourself, okay, give it to me. What's next? What's like, you just can't even sit there and enjoy that moment of praise, because your mind is already racing to think but there must be something that's not as good. So I think it comes down to like human nature, which is negativity. Our brains are wired for negativity as a bias, as opposed to think like, actually, this can go really well.
Yeah, there's that great quote that says that our brains are wired like Velcro for negative thoughts and Teflon for positive thoughts.
Whenever that's happening, I think that's when the journaling comes back in again to really help you counter your thoughts and to think about, because as you go on in life and you gain a bit more life, you have more experiences to build on from in your portfolio. And it's so powerful to go back to a time when you struggled, when you were fearful, and to go back and think like, hey, how did I actually overcome that? And it's very simple. You take action, you might not get the result you want. But if you don't take action, you don't get anything at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's so right. And I think also in here, and what I'm wondering is there's also another gendered piece. Brené Brown talks about the big challenge to get to a place of vulnerability for men is really to start to associate vulnerability as something that can be masculine, that can be manly, that it's okay to be vulnerable, as opposed to that narrative around masculinity, which is about bravery and courage and out there and fighting and whatever. And that the challenge for women is much more about the unwiring of perfectionism and being a little bit messy and being okay. So when we're talking about freedom to fail, it's also giving yourself permission to be a little bit messy, to be a little bit imperfect, which is uncomfortable and vulnerable. I mean, is that something that you resonate with, or how does that?
Oh, absolutely. You're so spot on. I was like, oh my God, she's on to me. I think I'm a recovering perfectionist. I don't know if even recovering. No, this is feedback that throughout the years in my career might come back in the 360, that not all tasks or projects or what have you are created equal. And that really perfectionism is such a way to hold yourself back. There's a saying in Facebook, which I love: done is better than perfect. Now, this is not true for everything, but think about it. If you give everything the exact same treatment, like, how do you go on in life? So you just need to be very clear and prioritize ruthlessly around what deserves red carpet treatment and what doesn't. So I think you're right. This notion of, perfectionism, of how you run your household, how you dress, whatever project and what have you. I think yes, there's a place for excellence, absolutely, and providing and delivering on good quality piece of work. But that can't be true for everything you do and touch. So I think it's around getting clearer with yourself of all the things that you've got on your plate. What is worthy and deserving of a level of perfectionism and red carpet treatment versus what just needs to be done is better than perfect.
Yes, and that nuance that you just gave us, which is that there is actually a difference between excellence and perfectionism. They're like, yeah, but if I don't strive to be perfect, then I'm letting go of my value of excellence, of pushing myself to be, you know, as great as I can. Actually, let's just decouple that, because perfectionism is an overuse of an excellence, right? I love that. I love the done is better than perfect idea as well. But I also love that nuance that you just pointed to, which is between excellence and perfectionism.
Yeah.
Gosh, I'm loving this conversation so much. As you can see, I'm totally geeking out over it. And so I guess all of this, there's so much richness and so much that people can take away. If you were to, I guess, speak directly to people that are listening today, what are some of the words of wisdom, the things of advice, the things that you want them to consider for themselves based on what you've learned, based on what you've experienced?
So 3 things I would say. The first one would be action leads to result. It may not necessarily be the one that you want originally, but then from there you can move forward. So do something, even if it's like a little something, better than not doing anything at all. The second one is counter negativity bias. Live your life as if it's rigged in your favor. I think when you do that, you just behave differently compared to when you let and allow the little voice inside your head to take over. And then thirdly, you can't do it alone. Like, figure out who is the power in your pack and around you, and share so people can hold you accountable and you can be on that journey together. They'd be the 3 things that I would love to leave your listeners with.
Yeah, perfect. My eyes started to well up, which means I really internalized what you just said there. And I love the framing of that. Imagine that life is rigged in your favor. I always think, imagine if we gave some of the headspace and thoughts that we give to imagining all the worst case scenarios and all the things that can go wrong and all the things that we're not doing or being and all the rest of it. What if we allocated a percentage of that? I mean, ideally all of it, but even just a portion of that to imagining the best case scenario, to imagining that, like you've just described, that life is rigged in your favor, that things will work out, the energy that gives, the aliveness that gives. And that is, I think, consistent with people that I see that are really living a life that I would describe as bright, as that they are living fully in themselves. It's coming from a place of, there's a mindset here. There's something that they're tapping into. So I just love the way that you framed it. I've never heard it described like that. Is there anything, before I kind of wrap up, is there anything that you feel that we didn't get to that you wanted to cover off?
Gosh, we talked about so much, and I think some of it I hadn't even expected per se. No, I'm at peace. I really enjoyed the conversation, and it's really interesting because as you draw certain things out of me, I am again reminded of some things myself. So it's been just such a joy and pleasure and honor to have this conversation with you.
It is truly a pleasure. And I have felt greatly inspired by your stories, by what you've shared, really, really moved by the way that you've been able to make it so accessible for myself and I imagine for others, but also just the way that, like, I feel knowing that people like you are in positions of leadership, are thinking about some of these ideas and the ideas that you've given that are framed in a way that make it so powerful. So I really deeply want to thank you for making the time to join today.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, Bex, for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today for another episode of Not Just Anything for Women Who Want It Whole. If you enjoyed our discussion, be sure to subscribe to our weekly podcast and leave us a review. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to having you join again. And remember, be brave, be whole, be you.